In today's lesson, we are going to have a look at the Cartesian plane. So to start with, we're going to have a look at some of the basic features of a Cartesian plane. So Cartesian plane is formed by two perpendicular lines. So perpendicular lines, what are perpendicular lines? Perpendicular lines are two lines that cut each other at right angles. Now let's quickly remember what a right angle is. A right angle is an angle that equals 90 degrees. Now when we have two lines that cut each other at 90 degrees, we have a horizontal line and we have a vertical line. So in a Cartesian plane, the horizontal line is called the x-axis and the vertical line is called the y-axis. So what does a Cartesian plane look like? Now let's have a look at this diagram that's given to us right here. Now in this diagram, you notice that two lines cut each other at 90 degrees. Now, what do we notice in this diagram? We notice that the marks on the x and y axis have been evenly spaced, and the distance between each mark is 1 unit. Now on the center of the axis, of the x and y axis, is our 0. Now we call this point as the origin of the Cartesian plane. Then we have the positive values for x, then we have the positive values for y, the negative values for x on the left hand side of the origin, the negative values for y on the bottom of the origin. So the first part of today's lesson, we are going to locate points on a Cartesian plane. So to locate any point on the Cartesian plane, we use a pair of numbers called Cartesian coordinates. Now these numbers are written in a set of brackets separated by a comma. So for example, a 2, 3. So we can call this as a Cartesian coordinate. The first number in the bracket is the x coordinate of the point. The second number in the bracket is the y coordinate of the point. So if we consider this particular Cartesian coordinate, then the 2 would be the x coordinate of the point and 3 would be the y coordinate of the point. Now let's have a look at this diagram here. Now this is a Cartesian plane where we have 2 points being plotted on the Cartesian plane. We have a point A and point B. So in this activity we are going to work out the coordinates for point A and point B. So remember, when we write Cartesian coordinates, we write them in brackets. So it's a pair of numbers separated by commas. The first number is the x value of the point. So if you notice this particular point here, the value on the x-axis for this particular point is a 2. So the x coordinate of point A is going to be a 2. And if you notice, the y coordinate or the value on the y-axis for this point A is a 4. So which means the y coordinate of point A is going to be a 4. Now let's move to point B. So the most important thing is when we start writing the coordinates, we always start with the x value followed by the y value. So the x value for point B, as we notice in this diagram, is a -4. And the y value for the coordinate for point B is a -3. So -4, -3. And that completes the coordinates for points A and B. So moving on, we have another example here. We have been given a Cartesian plane. Now in this case, we only have the positive value for x and the positive value for y. So we have been asked to work out the coordinates of point A, B, C, and D. So let's start with point A. Now again, when it comes to Cartesian coordinate, we are going to first write down the x value followed by a y value with a comma in the middle. So let's start with point A. So for point A, the x value that we can note is a 3. So I'm going to note down a 3 for the x, and the y value is going to be a 1. Let's go to point B, for instance. So point B, the x value is a 1 and the y value is a 3. For point C, now if you notice point C is on the y-axis. So if the point is on the y-axis, the value for x, as we notice, is 0. So the x value for point C is 0, and the y value for point C is a 4. And finally, point D. Now point D, the x value for point D is a 1, and the y value, now if you notice here, the y value is exactly in between 1 and 2, exactly halfway in between 1 and 2. So the y value for point D is going to be 1.5, and those are the coordinates of those 4 points. Now in the last section of this lesson, we are going to look at the quadrants, or the different sections of the Cartesian plane. Now, as we talked about earlier, the point in the middle, which is our 0, is the origin. Now, if both x and y are positive, that becomes the first quadrant. If x is negative, y is positive, that's our second quadrant. If both x and y are negative, that's our third quadrant. If x is positive, y is negative, that becomes our fourth quadrant of the Cartesian plane. So as we notice, the Cartesian plane has been divided into 4 quadrants. Now in this following example, we are going to locate the points A, B, C, and D in the following Cartesian plane. Now let's start with point A. Now as I notice, if I compare the two diagrams, the top one and the bottom one, I notice point A is in the second quadrant. Point B, as we notice here, is in the fourth quadrant. Point C. Now look at point C carefully. It is not in any quadrant, but it directly falls on the y-axis. So we're going to write it just as on the y-axis. Point D, what do we notice about point D? It is directly falling on the x-axis. So we're just going to call it on the x-axis. And finally, point E. Now point E is in the third quadrant. That's it from me today, students. Have a lovely day.